The Jenkins home radiated with warmth and celebration. It was their 20th wedding anniversary, and the occasion had drawn close friends and family into their elegantly lit backyard. The scent of roasted lamb and fresh bread wafted through the air, mingling with laughter and the gentle clink of glasses. Greg Jenkins, a 57-year-old software consultant with a sharp mind and a quieter demeanor, stood near the drink station, a glass of wine in hand. His wife, Evelyn, 55, was in her element, flitting between guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. Her laughter rang out occasionally, warm and inviting, but there was something about it tonight that made Greg pause. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Evelyn seemed different. Not in the way she looked. She was as stunning as ever, her black dress hugging her figure and her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, but in her energy, felt distant. The note as the evening unfolded, Greg found himself chatting with an old colleague near the buffet. Their conversation was interrupted when a waiter discreetly slipped a folded note into his hand. "For you, sir," the waiter murmured before vanishing into the crowd. Greg's brow furrowed as he unfolded the paper. The message was hastily scrawled, "Check the guest house at 9 p.m. Come alone." He glanced at his watch, 8:45. His pulse quickened. The guest house was a small, detached structure at the far end of the property. They rarely used it except for storage, and there was no reason for anyone to be there during the party. Greg's first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank, but a gnawing sense of curiosity and unease kept him from doing so. The first clue at precisely 9 p.m., Greg excused himself from the party and slipped away toward the guest house. The pathway was dimly lit, and the sound of laughter from the backyard grew faint as he approached the small building. The door was ajar. Greg hesitated before stepping inside. The room was dark, but the faint smell of perfume, Evelyn's perfume, lingered in the air. On the coffee table lay another note, along with a small envelope. The note read, "I didn't want you to find out this way. Forgive me." Greg's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a hotel keycard and a printed reservation under Evelyn's name, for 2 guests. A festive facade. Greg returned to the party, his mind racing. He scanned the crowd for Evelyn, who was laughing with a group of friends near the fire pit. She looked carefree, radiant even. The juxtaposition was jarring. Was it possible that this note was some kind of mistake? Or worse, a cruel joke? But as the night wore on, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. He caught Evelyn exchanging glances with a man he didn't recognize. A tall, well-dressed figure who seemed just a little too attentive to her every move. Greg's thoughts spiraled. Was this man her accomplice? The one she planned to leave him for? A mysterious guest. As the party began to wind down, Greg made his way to the stranger. The man was chatting casually with another guest but greeted Greg with an easy smile when he approached. "Greg Jenkins," Greg said, extending his hand. "I don't believe we've met." "Alan Reed," the man replied, his grip firm. "A friend of Evelyn's from her volunteer work." Greg nodded, his smile forced. "Ah, the charity committee. She's mentioned it." Alan's expression didn't falter, but Greg noticed the briefest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Well, it's nice to finally meet you," Greg said, his voice even. "You as well," Alan replied. "Evelyn speaks highly of you." The confrontation later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Greg couldn't contain his suspicion any longer. Evelyn was in their bedroom, brushing her hair, when he stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Evelyn turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" Greg held up the hotel keycard and the note. "Care to explain this?" Her face paled, and for a moment, Greg thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, setting her brush down. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said quietly. "So it's true." Greg's voice cracked. "You're planning to leave me?" "For him." Evelyn looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it, Evelyn?" Greg demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been planning this for a while. A half-truth. Evelyn hesitated before answering. Alan and we've been working on something together. Something private. It's complicated. Complicated. Greg spat. You call a hotel reservation complicated? Evelyn's voice wavered. I can't explain everything right now. But please believe me, I never meant to hurt you. Greg stared at her, his heart pounding. If you don't tell me the truth, Evelyn, I'll find it myself. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression conflicted. I just need time, Greg. Please. Greg shook his head, his jaw tightening. Time is the one thing you don't have. A silent resolve that night, Greg lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Evelyn's words replayed in his mind. There was a part of him that wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the hurt ran too deep. He resolved to follow the trail she had left, no matter where it led. Whatever secrets Evelyn was hiding, Greg would uncover them, and he wouldn't stop until he knew the truth. The morning after the party, Greg was a man consumed. While Evelyn moved about the house, her movements careful and her demeanor subdued, Greg sat in his study, piecing together the fragments of the night before. The hotel reservation, the stranger Alan Reed, Evelyn's vague and evasive answers. It all pointed to something far more insidious than a simple affair. The hotel visit. By mid-morning, Greg had decided to visit the hotel listed on the key card. Clutching the card tightly, he parked his car a block away and approached the lobby, trying to appear casual. The hotel exuded luxury, its grand chandelier casting a warm glow on the marble floors. Greg approached the front desk, his heart pounding. Good morning, he said, forcing a polite smile. I believe my wife checked in here recently, and I wanted to confirm the details of her stay. Evelyn Jenkins. The clerk, a young woman with a professional demeanor, typed into her computer. Let me see. Yes. Mrs. Jenkins had a reservation for one night, 2 guests. Checked in yesterday evening and checked out this morning. Greg's stomach twisted. Did she leave a forwarding address or any special notes? The clerk shook her head. I'm afraid not. But she did leave this in her room. She handed Greg a small envelope with Evelyn's name scrawled on the front. Thank you, Greg murmured, retreating to a quiet corner of the lobby. A cryptic message inside the envelope was a single piece of paper with a handwritten note. Alan, everything is set for Tuesday. Let's meet at the safe house to finalize. Greg's pulse quickened. A safe house? What were they planning? It wasn't just an affair anymore. This was something far more elaborate. Greg's mind raced with possibilities. Was Evelyn involved in something illegal? Was Alan manipulating her into something dangerous? Revisiting the guest house. Greg's next stop was the guest house, where the initial note had led him. This time, he scoured the space more thoroughly, searching for anything that could shed light on Evelyn's secret. In a drawer beneath some old linens, he found a small, locked box. Using a screwdriver from his tool set, he pried it open. Inside was a burner phone and a collection of photographs. The photographs were of Greg, Evelyn, and Alan, separately, never together. One picture of Greg appeared to be taken outside his office, another of Evelyn near their home, and one of Alan entering a nondescript building. Greg's hands trembled as he flipped through the images. Why were they being followed? And by whom? Greg's first call that evening, Greg called the only person he could trust to help unravel this mystery. His younger brother, Sam, a retired investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth. This sounds bigger than an affair, Sam said after Greg explained everything. A safe house? Surveillance photos? You might be dealing with something criminal. What do I do? Greg asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Sam paused. You need to keep your cool and gather more evidence. Whatever Evelyn's involved in, you won't stop it by confronting her too early. Follow the trail. Following Alan, Greg decided his next step was to tail Alan Reed. He parked outside the man's apartment the following afternoon, watching as Alan emerged in a sleek black car. Greg followed at a safe distance, his heart racing as they wound through the city. Alan eventually pulled into the lot of a downtown office building. Greg waited, snapping photos with his phone as Alan entered. Curiosity got the better of him, and Greg followed inside, keeping a few paces behind. The building housed several businesses, but Alan entered an office labeled Atlas Consulting Group. Greg noted the name and left quickly, worried that staying too long would draw attention. The revelation that night, Greg did some digging. A quick online search revealed that Atlas Consulting Group was a private firm specializing in risk management and crisis consulting. But a deeper dive uncovered a murkier reputation. Whispers of off-the-record dealings, discreet problem-solving for high-profile clients, and connections to legal gray areas. Greg's stomach sank. If Alan worked for Atlas, was Evelyn involved in their operations? Had she been coerced, or was she a willing participant? Confronting Evelyn again, unable to contain his suspicions any longer, Greg confronted Evelyn again that evening. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when he entered with the photographs and burner phone in hand. "Evelyn," Greg said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk. Now." Evelyn froze, her knife hovering above the cutting board. "Greg, what is it?" Greg placed the items on the counter. "Explain this." Her face went pale as she looked at the photos, her hand trembling. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," Greg snapped. "What matters is why they exist. Who's following us? Evelyn? And why are you meeting Alan at a safe house?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. "Don't play innocent," Greg said, his anger rising. "I followed Alan to his office. I know he works for Atlas. Are you part of their operation? What are you doing behind my back?" Evelyn sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Then tell me what it is," Greg demanded. A half-confession. Evelyn looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Alan isn't just a colleague. He's part of something bigger. And so am I." "Bigger?" Greg echoed. "What does that mean?" Evelyn hesitated. "We've been investigating something. Corruption. People who've done terrible things. Alan brought me in because I had access to certain information through your work." "My work?" Greg's blood ran cold. "What kind of information?" "Contracts. Client lists," Evelyn admitted. "Alan needed them to connect the dots." Greg stared at her, his mind spinning. "So you're saying you used me? You put our lives at risk for some covert investigation." "I didn't have a choice," Evelyn said. "These people, if we don't expose them, they'll ruin lives. But if they find out we're onto them..." Her voice trailed off, the implication clear. The weight of truth. Greg stepped back, his anger giving way to fear. "You've endangered us both, Evelyn. And for what? To play spy." "It's not a game," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "And I need you to trust me." Greg shook his head. "Trust? That's long gone, Evelyn. And so is any chance of fixing this if you don't start telling me everything." The silence between them was deafening, the weight of Evelyn's secrets threatening to collapse everything they had built. But Greg wasn't done yet. If Evelyn wouldn't give him the full truth, he would find it himself, even if it meant tearing their lives apart in the process. Greg awoke the next morning with the weight of the previous night still heavy on his chest. Evelyn's half-confession churned in his mind like a storm, each word raising more questions than answers. Her claim of being involved in an investigation to expose corruption seemed plausible on the surface, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that she was still withholding something, perhaps the most critical piece of the puzzle. Greg was done playing the passive observer. He needed the truth, and if Evelyn wasn't going to give it to him willingly, he would find it himself. A key connection. Greg decided to dig deeper into Atlas Consulting Group. Using Sam's journalist contacts, he acquired a dossier on the firm, and what he found sent chills down his spine. Atlas wasn't just a consulting group, it was a private intelligence agency operating on the fringes of legality. Known for handling sensitive matters for wealthy clients, the company's reputation was shrouded in whispers of blackmail, data theft, and coercion. And Alan Reed wasn't just an employee. He was listed as one of their senior operatives, a man with a history of exploiting vulnerabilities to achieve his objectives. Greg's mind raced. Was Evelyn a pawn in Alan's schemes? Or was she a willing accomplice? Tracking the safe house using the note Evelyn had left in the hotel, Greg set out to locate the safe house. After hours of searching online forums and real estate records, he pinpointed a possible address in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. That evening, he drove to the location, parking a block away and approaching on foot. The building was unremarkable. A small brick structure with tinted windows and no signage. Greg crouched behind a dumpster, watching as cars arrived intermittently. Alan's sleek black sedan was parked outside, and Greg's pulse quickened when he spotted Evelyn exiting the building with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She paused, glancing around nervously, before getting into Alan's car. The confrontation. Greg followed the car as it wound through the city, finally stopping at a quiet cafe. From his vantage point in a nearby alley, Greg watched as Evelyn and Alan entered and took a seat by the window. They spoke animatedly, their expressions shifting between tension and urgency. At one point, Alan slid a manila envelope across the table, which Evelyn reluctantly opened. Whatever was inside made her blanch. Greg couldn't take it anymore. He stepped out of the alley and entered the cafe, his heart pounding. "Mind if I join you?" he said, his voice cold. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, while Alan's expression remained unreadable. "This is unexpected," Alan said smoothly. "You have no idea," Greg replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down. The unveiling Evelyn stammered, her voice trembling. "Greg, I can explain." "Save it," Greg snapped, turning to Alan. "I know who you are, and I know what Atlas does. So why don't you tell me why my wife is involved in your little operation?" Alan raised an eyebrow, his demeanor calm. "Your wife came to us, Mr. Jenkins. She wanted to help expose a powerful group of individuals who've been exploiting people like you for decades." Greg scoffed. "People like me? What does that even mean?" Alan leaned forward, his voice lowering. "The clients you've worked with, Mr. Jenkins, some of them aren't as legitimate as you think. Evelyn gave us access to your records because they contain the evidence we need to bring these people down." Greg's jaw tightened. "So you used me? Both of you?" "It's not like that," Evelyn said desperately. "I didn't know how deep it went when I started. But once I realized, I couldn't walk away." The turning point. Greg's fury simmered beneath the surface, but Alan's next words caught him off guard. "There's more at stake here than your marriage, Mr. Jenkins," Alan said. "If we don't act now, these people will destroy countless lives. We need your help." Greg stared at him, incredulous. "You expect me to help you after everything you've done? After you manipulated my wife and put us both in danger?" Alan met his gaze evenly. "I understand your anger, but the truth is you're already involved. Whether you like it or not, they know about you. If we don't finish this, you'll be the one left to face the consequences." An impossible choice. Later that evening, Greg and Evelyn sat in silence at the kitchen table. "I should have told you everything from the start," Evelyn said, her voice thick with regret. "I was trying to protect you, but I see now how much I've hurt you." Greg stared at her, his emotions a tumultuous mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Evelyn, but right now, forgiveness isn't the issue. The issue is whether I trust you enough to go along with this." Evelyn's eyes brimmed with tears. "Please, Greg, help me make this right." Greg exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "If I agree to this, it's not for you. It's to protect myself, and to ensure this ends once and for all." The next move. The following day, Greg met with Alan and Evelyn at the safe house. They laid out the full scope of the operation, a plan to infiltrate a high-profile event where the key players in the corruption scheme would be present. Evelyn's role was to extract critical data using the laptop Alan had provided, while Greg would act as her cover. It was risky, dangerous, and fraught with uncertainty. But Greg had made up his mind. If this was the only way to regain control of his life, he would see it through to the end. As he left the safe house that evening, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days leading up to the high-profile gala were tense. Greg and Evelyn worked alongside Alan and his team, their roles meticulously planned. Evelyn's task was clear: extract critical data from the servers at the event, which Alan claimed would expose the shadowy network's illicit activities. Greg's role as her cover was less defined, but he knew his job: to ensure Evelyn didn't draw attention while keeping his own suspicions in check. Still, Greg couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Alan's smooth explanations and Evelyn's insistence on secrecy left too many unanswered questions. The gala begins. The venue was dazzling. A sprawling ballroom in a downtown skyscraper, its towering windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Guests in designer attire mingled beneath chandeliers, their conversations laced with wealth and power. Greg adjusted his tie as he and Evelyn entered, their practiced smiles masking the tension between them. Evelyn was breathtaking in a dark green gown, her composure cool and confident. "I'll be in and out," she whispered as they navigated the crowd. "Just stick to the plan." Greg nodded, his eyes scanning the room for Alan, who was already positioned at the bar, watching like a hawk. A dangerous encounter. As Evelyn slipped away toward the server room, Greg found himself face to face with one of the gala's hosts, a man he recognized from a client dinner years ago. "Greg Jenkins," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a while." "Andrew Marsh," Greg replied, forcing a smile of his own. "Didn't expect to see you here." Marsh's gaze was sharp, his tone laced with insinuation. "And I didn't expect to see you at an event like this. Tell me, what brings you here tonight?" Greg's mind raced. "Networking," he said smoothly. "Always good to stay connected." Marsh's smile widened, but it was far from friendly. "Of course. Enjoy the evening." As Marsh moved on, Greg's unease deepened. Marsh was a powerful executive with a reputation for ruthless deals and murky alliances. If he was involved in the network Alan and Evelyn were targeting, Greg knew they were playing with fire. The extraction. Meanwhile, Evelyn reached the server room, where a security badge she'd swiped earlier gave her access. The room was quiet except for the hum of servers, the dim glow of their screens casting eerie shadows. She connected the laptop Alan had provided, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she initiated the data transfer. But as the progress bar inched forward, Evelyn's heart sank. The files weren't just incriminating. They implicated not only Marsh and his associates but also several of Greg's past clients. The revelations were damning, and Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that Greg would be collateral damage if this information went public. Her hand hesitated over the keyboard. A sudden twist back in the ballroom, Greg's phone buzzed. A text from Alan. "Something's off. Marsh is onto us. Be ready to move." Greg's pulse quickened. He glanced toward the bar, where Alan was already making his way toward the exit. But before Greg could react, Marsh reappeared, his expression cold. "Enjoying yourself, Jenkins?" Marsh asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Greg forced a calm demeanor. "It's been a great evening." Marsh leaned in, his voice low. "I'd be careful if I were you. Some people here don't take kindly to uninvited guests." Greg's stomach churned as Marsh walked away. The unspoken threat was clear, and Greg knew Evelyn's window of opportunity was closing fast. The chase. Evelyn completed the transfer just as footsteps echoed outside the server room. She barely had time to eject the laptop before the door burst open, revealing a security guard. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" he demanded. Evelyn feigned composure, holding up the badge she'd swiped. "I'm with the IT team, just checking a connection issue." The guard's skepticism was evident, but before he could question her further, an alarm sounded from elsewhere in the building. The distraction was enough for Evelyn to slip past him and disappear into the crowd. The revelation. Evelyn found Greg near the exit, his expression taut with concern. "Did you get it?" he asked. "Yes," Evelyn said breathlessly. "But Greg..." There's more to this than I realized. You're in danger. Greg's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Before Evelyn could answer, Alan appeared, gesturing for them to follow. We need to move. Now. A shocking betrayal. The trio made their way to a nearby parking garage, where Alan's car was waiting. As they climbed inside, Evelyn clutched the laptop tightly, her mind racing. But as the car sped through the city, Greg noticed something strange. Alan wasn't heading toward the safe house. Where are we going? Greg demanded. Alan's expression remained calm. A secure location. Greg's suspicion turned to anger. You're lying. What's really going on, Alan? Alan sighed, his mask of professionalism slipping. I'm sorry, Greg, but this was never just about taking down Marsh. We needed leverage, and your connections were the perfect bait. Evelyn's face turned white. You used us. Alan nodded. The files we extracted won't just expose Marsh's network. They'll take down anyone connected to him, including Greg. A choice to make Greg's mind reeled. You set me up to fall with them. Why? Collateral damage, Alan said coldly. We couldn't get close enough to Marsh without you, and now you're the perfect scapegoat. Evelyn turned to Greg, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, Greg. I swear. Alan smirked. Believe her or not, it doesn't matter. The wheels are already in motion. But Alan underestimated Greg. In a sudden move, Greg grabbed the steering wheel, jerking the car toward the side of the road. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and Greg and Evelyn scrambled out before Alan could react. The escape. Greg and Evelyn ran through the dark streets, adrenaline propelling them forward. They found refuge in a nearby diner, where they caught their breath and began to process what had just happened. We're in deeper than I thought, Greg said grimly. And if we don't find a way to turn this around, we're both finished. Evelyn nodded, her expression resolute. Then we fight back. Together. The diner's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Greg and Evelyn sat across from each other, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. Alan had betrayed them, using their lives and reputations as pawns in a scheme far more twisted than they'd imagined. Greg leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. We have to get ahead of this. If Alan's plan goes through, everything we've built is gone. Evelyn nodded, her expression steely. We need to expose him before he exposes us. But Greg knew it wouldn't be easy. Alan was calculating, and the files Evelyn had stolen could just as easily be used to destroy them as they could to take down Marsh and his network. The plan. Greg and Evelyn worked late into the night at a motel, piecing together their strategy. Evelyn had kept a backup of the files she'd extracted, and together they pored over the data, searching for leverage. It was there, buried among the documents, a series of financial transactions linking Alan to the very corruption he claimed to be exposing. He wasn't just an operative working for Atlas. He was skimming from the top, funneling millions into offshore accounts under fake names. Greg stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. This is it. If we can get this to the right people, we can turn the tables. Evelyn hesitated. But who can we trust? Everyone Alan's connected to is either complicit or under his thumb. Greg thought for a moment before pulling out his phone. I know someone. Calling in a favor. Greg's call was to Sam, his journalist brother, who had always thrived on exposing corruption and injustice. When Sam arrived at the motel the next morning, he brought a cautious optimism. This is big, he said, flipping through the files. If we play this right, we can not only take down Alan but also shine a light on the whole operation. And if we play it wrong? Greg asked. Sam looked up, his expression serious. Then you and Evelyn become the fall guys for everything. Setting the trap. Sam proposed a bold plan. They would arrange a meeting with Alan, pretending to offer him the files as leverage to clear their names. Meanwhile, Sam would use his media connections to ensure that if anything went wrong, the evidence against Alan and his network would go public. The meeting was set for the following night at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location Alan himself had suggested when Greg reached out. The warehouse was dark and cavernous, its air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Greg and Evelyn arrived first, the backup drive containing the incriminating files tucked inside Greg's coat pocket. Alan arrived shortly after, flanked by two men who looked more like hired muscle than colleagues. "I'm glad you came to your senses," Alan said smoothly, his eyes scanning the room. "Let's make this quick." Greg stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. "We're here for one reason, to clear our names. You take the files and you make sure we're left out of whatever fallout is coming." Alan smirked. "Of course. As long as I get what I need, you'll be free to go on with your lives." Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. "We want guarantees, Alan. No loose ends." Alan's smirk widened. "You're in no position to negotiate." The double cross as Alan reached for the drive. A loud voice echoed through the warehouse. "Stop right there." Sam emerged from the shadows, holding up a phone that was recording the exchange. "Smile, Alan. You're on camera." Alan's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "What the hell is this?" "It's the end of the line," Sam said. "I've got your confession on tape, and I've already sent the files to multiple outlets. If anything happens to Greg or Evelyn, the whole world will know who you really are." Alan's men tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons. "You think you've won?" Alan snarled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Greg stepped forward, his voice firm. "We know exactly who we're dealing with, and now so does everyone else." The showdown before Alan could respond. The sound of sirens pierced the air. Moments later, a swarm of law enforcement officers flooded the warehouse, their weapons trained on Alan and his men. One of the officers stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the dim light. "Alan Reed, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, and a laundry list of other charges." Alan's composure cracked as he was handcuffed and led away, his protests falling on deaf ears. Greg and Evelyn stood side by side, their relief palpable. Sam clapped Greg on the shoulder. "You did it." "No," Greg said, his voice quiet. "We did it." Picking up the pieces in the days that followed, the story of Alan Reed's betrayal and the takedown of Marsh's network dominated headlines. Greg and Evelyn were cleared of any wrongdoing, their names kept out of the media thanks to Sam's careful handling of the story. But for Greg, the victory was bittersweet. While the ordeal had brought him and Evelyn closer in some ways, it had also revealed cracks in their relationship that couldn't be ignored. A new beginning one evening. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Evelyn turned to Greg. "Do you think we'll ever be the same?" Greg took a long moment before answering. "No, but maybe that's a good thing. We've been through hell, Evelyn, and we're still standing." Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I want to rebuild, Greg. With you." Greg looked out at the horizon, the weight of their journey etched into his face. "Let's take it one day at a time." The epilogue in the end, Greg and Evelyn's story was one of resilience and redemption. They had faced betrayal, danger, and the loss of trust, yet they found a way to reclaim their lives together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in silence, the promise of a new chapter ahead of them.